This is Join Us in France, episode 196. Bonjour, I'm Annie, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, its many quirks, its history, its language, and of course, destinations in France you want to learn about because hopefully you'll be visiting soon. On today's episode, Elyse and I talk about a Paris neighborhood we both love, and that is Saint Germain des Près. It's as popular with visitors as Le Marais or the Latin Quarter, and just as lively and interesting. We tell you everything you need to know to explore this bustling neighborhood and enjoy one of Paris's most beloved historical districts. And if you're interested in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, you should also check out our other two episodes on classic Paris neighborhoods, episode 27 on Le Marais and episode 7 on the Latin Quarter. Show notes and photos for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/196, the number 196. Folks who are subscribed to the email list will get the extra having to do with this episode in a few days, where I summarize for you all the best parts of the Saint-Germain-des-Prés neighborhood, so you can just print that and take it with you when you go to Paris. Join Us in France is brought to you by Patreon supporters and Addicted to France, the small group tour company for people who want to enjoy France to the fullest with zero stress with me. And we have an upcoming tour in May 2018. It's coming up really, really quickly. And you can see what we're doing on addictedtofrance.com. And speaking of the Addicted to France tours, because I'll be away having fun with tour members, I won't release an episode on May 30th, but I will do my best to release one on June 6th, even though I won't be home yet. But that's the anniversary of D-Day, and I want to record an episode on the history of D-Day per se with Phil Robertson, who is so knowledgeable about the time period and the area. Join Us in France needs your support. To see all the ways you can support the show, visit joinusinfrance.com/support. Hello, Elyse.
Well, hi, Annie.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Yes, it's good to see you. We are talking about the Saint-Germain-des-Prés neighborhood today.
Yes.
Lovely place. I can't believe we haven't done that already.
I really thought we had. Well, I guess because one of the things about that area on the left bank of Paris, of the river, is that somehow I associate Latin Quarter and Saint-Germain-des-Prés. They're so together because they really do blend into one another. So I guess in my mind we did both, but we didn't.
We didn't.
No, we didn't.
I can tell you we didn't because people ask me about it, and yeah they didn't.
Well, we are making up for that.
Yes, today we are going to tell you all about it.
It's a great place.
It's beautiful. I love going there. Honestly, if I was rich enough to live in Paris, that's where I would look for an apartment.
Me too. Me too. Except that it would have to be not just a little rich. You would have to be very, 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 very rich. Actually, that's only in the last 60, 70 years that it's become that expensive to live there. It was not at the beginning of the 20th century. Although it's always been a very, very fashionable area to be in, but it was never quite that expensive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's out of control.
It's out of control.
Yeah. So it'll probably never happen, but one can hope.
Well, it's called Dream On, kid. There you are. Really.
All right. Tell us about the Saint-Germain-des-Prés neighborhood.
Okay. Well, as you know, and some of our listeners probably know also, it's basically an area that on the north side is bounded by the Seine River. Mm-hmm. On the east side is almost up to Boulevard Saint-Michel. Not quite, but that's the technical division as opposed to the kind of informal neighborhood division that most people say if they live on the west side of Boulevard Saint-Michel, starting in that area, they do say they live in the Saint Germain area.
Yeah.
And
Honestly, it's such a prestigious neighborhood.
Yeah.
That even if you're a few streets away, that's what I would say, is I live at Saint Germain.
Also, I think it locates it more or less in terms of yes, there's Left Bank and all of this, but it gives you an idea because there's another part. It is, of course, part of the 6th arrondissement, but there's a part of the 6th that is not actually included, that's further south. And then it almost goes into the 7th, which is one of the most chic and also very expensive neighborhoods of Paris. The Left Bank, at least the parts with the 3 arrondissements that touch the Seine, are rather chic.
Yes, rather, yes.
Yes, but they're also part of the oldest parts of Paris.
Well, that makes sense.
Which makes sense,
It goes together, I think.
They go together, yeah. It's interesting because I was thinking that some people don't realize that old, in this sense, is expensive. There's an equation. It's like a mathematical equation.
Yes.
Beautiful old limestone, 17th century, 18th century, even going into 19th century, equals expensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also with the problem with the terminology Saint-Germain-des-Prés neighborhood is that the definition is a bit amorphous.
Yeah.
It changes depending on the time in history. And nowadays, the only official designation is 6e arrondissement. The 6th arrondissement, we know where that stops and where that ends.
Right.
It's defined by law. But Saint-Germain-des-Prés, it's, it could... Some people will say, oh, let's include this little bit over here. And other people will say, no, let's not. Absolutely not.
Right.
So it just depends on who you ask. It's a historical construct.
It's a historical construct based around an actual structure. And, of course, the name Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Près means meadows.
Yes.
And that's because it is a very, 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 very ancient area in Paris. In fact, the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, has a part of it that is the oldest church in Paris still.
Wow.
Older than Notre Dame. And that is the tower, which dates from the 10th century.
Because Notre Dame is 1180.
Starting in
1180?
1180 into the 1200s.
Right.
Which and of course it took almost 200 years to finish anyway.
Year 1000, that's old.
That's old, yeah. It's really old. And of course, it's like a lot of churches, not just in Paris, but everywhere, pieces of it are from different centuries. So you can't say the whole thing is that old, but
right.
But the tower itself, which is this very beautiful squared stone, is indeed the part of the structure that was from the 10th century, which isn't even the oldest one because it actually was begun in the 500s.
Wow.
Which takes us really
early Middle Ages.
Very, very early Middle Ages, and under the. I went and did some research again because I love when I do research for us it's like one of those Russian doll things. You look at one thing and then you click on something, it takes you to something else, and then you click on something, it takes you somewhere else.
It's fun, isn't it?
It's fun, but then I think, okay, where did I start? And I have to go work my way back. The Merovingian were a dynasty of Franks, who of course were replaced by the Franks that gave the name France, and who were descendants of Clovis, so the Merovingians were the ones who established the first site of Saint-Germain-des-Prés,
of the church,
and at that time Paris was very, very, very small.
Sure.
So this was countryside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it was called Saint-Germain-des-Prés, because it was this huge countryside area, and they were given a huge allotment of land, and they had a huge abbey, which was walled in, but honestly, I don't even know how big the land was. Like if you had to ask me, to tell you where it ended, I don't know.
Right,
honestly,
probably
I don't know.
museums would have that type of
Right,
information.
right,
We'd have
right.
to go on.
But it was huge. I mean, it was they had their own lands for growing things, and it was outside the city walls of ancient Paris. But from that, I guess we would call that the early Middle Ages. I guess
500, yes.
Yeah,
500
it's
is
really the early
Middle
Middle Ages,
and
right?
Then to 1000, then you start calling it the High Middle Ages.
The High Middle Ages.
And then Late Middle Ages is just the last
I guess
100
Renaissance,
years.
into the Renaissance.
Yeah, it's 1400s.
Right.
So the 1400 to 1500s, that's the late Middle Ages.
Yeah.
But the biggest chunk of it is the early Middle Ages, the part that we know the least about,
Right.
because obviously a lot of it is gone.
A lot of it is gone, yeah. So the Merovingians were a dynasty that lasted actually from, I have the dates here, it's almost 300 years, from 481, when basically Christianity became an official religion.
Yep.
And it lasted until 751.
Okay.
So that's almost 300 years, right? And they were simply taken over by the next dynasty of Franks, who of course gave us Charlemagne, and then basically the administrative concept of France that still exists today.
Right.
Yeah. So, but they were the first. The Merovingians were the first to Christianize the area and to make Christianity an official religion, and therefore gave money for the building of abbeys.
Sure.
Because abbeys and monasteries were very important, because this is something, of course, this is kind of like one of those little asides, but it is still a curiosity to me. Under the Roman Empire, a lot of people were literate. In the period of this times, what we call the early Middle Ages, or what, of course, we've learned in school as the Dark Ages, which is kind of a sinister expression anyway.
It sure is.
It is, isn't it?
I don't think it was really the Dark Ages.
It wasn't, but very few people knew how to read anymore.
Exactly.
And the people who did know how to read were the people in the monasteries and convents. And they were the ones that kept literacy alive. They were the ones who did the scriptoriums, where they wrote the beautiful old books on parchment. And so they became these very important centers of learning, because they were the ones who really did know. They were the ones who could still read Latin and Greek and even Old Hebrew. And it's very interesting and strange to me. I'm not sure why that happened. That is, why did suddenly literacy center on these small communities like that? I don't know.
Probably because it takes so much time to become truly literate and read all these books. And if you need to be spending all your life growing food, you can't be sitting down reading or writing or copying or
and of course school as such didn't exist.
No.
There was no such thing as school. In any event, in the year 558, it became a royal abbey. And of course, who says royal says money, privilege, and it was given lots and lots and lots of money, and it became something interesting. I know you love Saint Denis. It was the first royal necropole for the kings before Saint Denis.
Ah, okay.
And then when the next dynasty, the Carolingians, came in, so I guess around the year 900, they moved it to the Abbey of Saint Denis, which of course now houses all of the many, many kings and queens.
Lots of them.
Lots and lots and lots of them.
Yes, and by necropole you mean it's the place where kings were buried.
That's right. Sorry, up there. Yes, yes. And so it was very important, and it was, of course, very important for the royalty to be buried there. So, and what they discovered, and this reminds me of something that's been recently discovered here also in Toulouse. They've, in the last 100 years, did some archaeological digging close to the church of Saint Germain, and they discovered some ruins of a Roman temple.
Oh, wow.
So, and this apparently is really typical almost everywhere, that the churches were very often built where there had been
other places of worship.
Other places of worship, of course, became known as paganism, but Roman temple, and there you are, because this was, of course, part of the Roman Lutèce, and that became
Yeah.
eventually Paris. So, and apparently this one was dedicated to Isis, which is kind of cool. I don't know why I think that's cool, but ridiculous. And the other thing is, the church Saint Germain des Près is right along Boulevard Saint Germain, which is what would you say? It's like about half of a mile from the river, or less than that. What would you say?
Not that much. Maybe a quarter of a mile, maybe something like that. It's pretty close.
Pretty close, but it's not right up against the river. And apparently the reason for that is because of the flooding.
Ah.
So they purposely moved the
Backed
church inland, the actual structure of the church with the cloister and everything around it, to make sure that there would not be flooding in the buildings. Even back then, because it was really difficult to control the Seine River.
Oh yeah, it's hard it's hard enough today with the technology we have, controlling the Seine River in the 500s or 700s or whatever. I don't think you had a chance.
No.
Yeah, you just had to put your stuff far away enough.
Far away. And of course, because we know that the ground underneath most of the center of Paris is all limestone, and it's very absorbent, and it's filled with holes and caves and things like that. So obviously they knew enough by that time that they had to be careful about things like that.
Yeah.
You know? So, but that was interesting to know that they actually did it that way. And then something I know that you've just mentioned that you were talking about, there were some relics. They got some very, very important relics. And of course, relics were very important in the Middle Ages because relics brought people, and that means it brought money.
Yeah.
Basically.
It was the tourism.
It was a kind of tourism. It was religious tourism.
Yeah.
And people don't, I guess, realize that was very important economically. It just was part of the whole thing. If you have good relics.
And also to give you notoriety.
Yeah.
You know, if you had a church with 3 or 4 or 5 relics of very famous saints, obviously you were more famous than the one that didn't have any.
That's right.
Or just the one.
That's right.
Yeah. So it was a big deal.
It was a big deal.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, it added to the prestige of this abbey, which already was fairly prestigious. Then, did you know that in the 800s, 3 different times, the entire area was pillaged and attacked by the Vikings?
I didn't know that. I'm not surprised.
In 845, in 856, and in 861. And the last time, they literally burned most of it down.
Jeez.
Which is why, when they rebuilt it starting in the 900s. They rebuilt it in a style that we recognize now, because that's, of course, the Romanesque style. And that is when they started adding the tower that is still partially there. So that tower goes back to actually 990.
Wow.
Which is really, really old. And that's when it became a Benedictine abbey.
Okay.
Because the rule of Saint Benoit was a reform rules that was in the 800s, and it was a way of cleaning up and bringing back to a sort of respectful way of being in the monasteries all over.
Yes.
You know, there's a tendency after a couple of hundred years of people in the monasteries to kind of let go of their religious
get comfortable.
Get comfortable.
Yes.
Get a little too comfortable. Right. So it became a Benedictine abbey with still the same prestige and privileges, and at that time became a center of learning. And it's from then on. And interestingly, that's what I think is so fascinating, because, of course, that takes us all the way up through into the 20th century. From basically the year 1000 up, Saint Germain, the abbey, and Saint Germain, the area, have been known as a neighborhood of intellectuals. And so it became the center of vast learning. People would come from all over. And it was because of that they became rivals with the university, which is just on the other side of Boulevard Saint-Michel.
Yes, very close.
The good old Latin Quarter.
Yes.
Which, of course, was also paid for and sponsored by the church.
Sure.
So there's a certain amount of land, which now, of course, is very beautiful, little narrow streets, that's kind of in between where one ended and the other began. And they would have to go all the way to Rome and the Pope to take care of these fights that they would have over, this land is mine, no, this land is mine. It's like the church wanted more land. I'm not sure why, maybe just to grow things. I haven't got a clue actually why. The university, of course, was because they were the most prestigious university and they wanted to have more.
And that was La Sorbonne.
And that was the Sorbonne and all the other buildings that surrounded it. And they wanted to have more places to build more buildings for centers of learning. But interestingly enough, they were both centers of learning. Mm-hmm. So they really competed with one another, but they probably added to the prestige of France. In the end, because they were competing with one another, they were constantly talking about different intellectual concepts and bringing in people from Italy and from other learned areas. So that they did that, and that of course goes all the way up through into the early 1700s, when this area, and more even the area that you and I know super well around Boulevard Saint Germain and close to the Près, which is, of course, one of the oldest cafes in existence in Paris, which was started in 1686. This was the area where the intellectuals known as the encyclopedists hung out. So this is Diderot and Voltaire.
Yep.
And all of these incredible writers and intellectuals. And luckily for them, at the same time that they were alive and working on their books and arguing all these new ideas, this was the time that the idea of a cafe as a place to go was introduced. What a wonderful conjunction of things,
this is nice.
This is nice, my idea of good, Go sit, hang out in a cafe and talk about stuff, and this is what they did. Mm-hmm. And so you have the beginning of this new kind of public place that never existed before, and that is literally the cafe chocolate house, because very often, in fact, at that time, they were either drinking hot chocolate, or they were drinking coffee. And they would sit around and they argued ideas. And so the Près, which is really cool because it is still there.
Yes, and it looks very old.
And it's very old and it's very beautiful. And of course, it's bordered on one side by this little street that's all cobblestones. And that is the street of the market, the street that goes into Saint-André-des-Arts. But this is really where they would hang out, smoking their pipes and arguing about things. And it's kind of cool because it goes all the way up through into modern times, that this is, of course, what people associate with the neighborhood. So,
do you think people still go there to...
I think, unfortunately, now it's tourists that go there.
Yeah, it's touristy, I
think. It's touristy.
Yeah.
The Près is really now a place people go to say, I've been in the Près.
Yeah.
Which
is a fine reason.
Which is fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that. But
we're not solving the problems of the world anymore in the Près.
No. And we're not writing articles about for the encyclopedia either. I don't think.
No.
And as a matter of fact, I think if you were a writer and you wanted to go and spend the day writing, sitting at a table at the Près, I'm not sure you'd be welcome.
I don't think you would, no. I think you'd have to go to one of the other smaller little cafes that are on Saint-André-des-Arts or Rue Bucci, which are, of course, it's still in the heart of the tourist area. But you're absolutely right. I think now, after you've spent your €5 for an espresso, probably
which is outrageous, by
which
the way.
Of course is outrageous. You would probably, after 1 hour, they would come over and ask what else you wanted, and they would kind of give you that, like, if you don't, let's go somewhere else. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, it's also where the people who prepared the revolution, the French Revolution, hung out. That is not just in the Près, but in the 2 or 3 other cafes right in that area. So you have Danton and Marais and all the other real intellectuals of the French Revolution. They followed this tradition 100 years later of hanging out in cafes. And of course, the Rue Danton is just 2 streets away. He really lived on that street. They lived in that neighborhood because it was not fashionable. It wasn't touristy. It was simply a place with lots of old houses from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And that is where a lot of people lived. And that is, in fact, why they went to these areas. But that, I think, is cool. I mean, it's like you walk these streets. One of the things about this neighborhood that is so wonderful, you and I both love doing this, is walking these streets.
Yes.
The history of this area is just absolutely incredible.
Yes, and it's even better if you have some knowledge of what happened there.
Yeah.
You know, that's where all the historical reading that you might do about the revolution or other topics would come in handy, because you're like, oh, this is where it happened, you know, which I just love that part. Like being somewhere and going, this is where this important thing happened.
And it's very beautiful in the way that old Paris is beautiful. It's small houses, except for on Saint Germain des Près, which of course got changed into big, beautiful apartment buildings in the 19th century under Haussmann. But otherwise, all the little narrow streets still have that medieval feel to them.
Oh, they sure do. And if you go in winter, it's kind of gloomy, some of them, because they're narrow, and there's not a lot of natural light that comes down these narrow streets. So it can be a little bit gloomy, but in the summer or in the spring, it's absolutely glorious.
It's glorious. You know. So basically, it's an area that served as a stimulation for intellectuals starting in about the year 1000 and up through into the 1800s. And then I think it just became a kind of chic but sleepy area for a good part of the 19th century. Nothing spectacular particularly happened there, except that you have 2 streets away from the actual church. Delacroix had his studio.
Yes.
Which is still there, and is a teeny little museum.
Yeah, the Delacroix Museum.
It's very pretty on the Place van Furstenberg. And then
François?
Van Furstenberg.
Nice name.
I'm not sure why. I think it was the name of a general, to be honest.
Furstenberg.
Furstenberg, yes. Teeny little square. And what developed in the 19th century was that it became famous for its markets. Its outdoor food markets. It's not that far from the Seine River. And it became a very lively area, but in a much more middle-class kind of way. So that people would go, and up until the middle of the 20th century, it was still like that. It was still old Paris, very much like in the Latin Quarter, you have the Rue Mouffetard, you have all these open-air food stalls and people hawking all kinds of different wares, and then you have the people who were living on the side streets. And it also, the other thing that happened in the 19th century is that it became a center for bookshops. And when the big, when publishing started to be a little bit mechanized, and books were turned out more or less in
bigger numbers,
most of the most prestigious book publishers were first established in that area.
Ah, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. I know there's a couple of bookstores that people recommend you can visit today. Let's see, I wrote them down because there's one called L'Écume des Pages, and another one called La Une, Hune.
Ah, that one I've heard of.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, with the H, I've heard of it. Without the H, I haven't.
Now, it's interesting because L'Écume des Pages sounds like L'Écume des Jours,
yes,
the Boris Vian novel. So I wonder how old this bookstore really is. But anyway, because Boris Vian is, what, maybe he's been dead 50 years, maybe, something like that. So that's not so old. But anyway, that's 2 bookstores that are supposed to be really interesting to visit if you're into that kind of thing.
Because Gallimard and Seuil and 2 or 3 other of the most prestigious of the publishing houses were started by individuals in that area because of it being the book area. It's interesting that is really, and they're no longer there. And there are now still bookstores, but they've moved away. But for a long time, they were. This was where they published. This is where the writers would go, and because this is where they were making the books, it became, by the end of the 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th century, a center for the writers and the artists to hang out. So, of course, everyone knows about Montmartre for end of 19th century for the painters,
Sure, yes.
for Toulouse-Lautrec and Renoir and all of those people. But in fact, it moved from up there to the Saint Germain area at the beginning of the 20th century. And so you have Hemingway and Fitzgerald, the American writers who moved to Paris, and then the French writers, the early French writers of the 20th century, all hung out there. And they developed a hangout in 2 or 3 cafes, not the Procope particularly, but 2 or 3 others that are still there. 2 that are literally right across the street from the church of Saint Germain-des-Prés. One of this, the Deux Magots.
Les Deux Magots, yes.
Les Deux
Very
Magots.
famous.
Very famous. And the other one is the Café de Flore.
Yes, also extremely famous.
Also extremely famous. And those cafes started becoming the center of art and intellectual activity in the 1920s. Giacometti, famous Picasso, all of these artists would hang out there. And the writers. And then, of course, you go into the 1950s and you get these famous French writers like Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir.
Right.
This is where they hung out.
Yes.
And
that would have been an extraordinary time.
Oh, that would have been cool. Totally
Yes,
cool.
yes. Well, that's why the movie Midnight in Paris is so fun. Because you get to see some of that. Like they reimagined the places where these people hung out.
And they really did. Salvador Dali. I mean, all of these artists and writers.
Yeah.
And it must, of course, you would have had to be able to stand the smoke from the cigarettes. They all smoked.
If you didn't die.
If you didn't die after 10 minutes,
They probably drank a fair amount
Oh,
too.
yes, I think they did. I think that
Yes.
they, especially certain of them.
Yes.
I'm not sure about Jean-Paul Sartre, but certainly the artists did. I think Boris Vian was not bad on the alcohol too.
I'm sure he was, because some of his writings, you're like, oh, he was at lunch.
Yeah,
There was something going on.
yeah. A lot of them were. But this is also at the beginning of the 20th century where the first jazz clubs opened up in Paris. Now, of course, jazz came from
The US,
the
America,
US
yeah.
after World War I. But this is the area. You're right. I would love to go back to the 1920s, just for a few days, hang out with everybody, see how crazy they all were.
And it's so interesting because in many ways, the 1920s were awful times where people were extremely racist. A lot of these racist ideas that people had were born in the 1920s and kind of bloomed into Hitler, pretty much. But the reason why it bloomed is because people believed this crap. They really thought it was fine to despise Jews and to, think that some breeds, quote, were better than others and all of that stuff. So the 1920s are really fascinating because it's so awful, but at the same time, they had such vibrant communities of artists and authors and interesting people like that.
Well, interestingly, yes. And of course, you think about it, it's the 1920s. That was the time of prohibition in the United States.
True.
So it went crazy in a different direction in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And the contrast between what happened in France and what happened in Germany is largely because France was on the winning side. And so it had been, I think, for a very long time. Paris had always been considered to be an intellectual center in general.
Mm-hmm.
But after World War I, even Germans who were liberal and free-thinking and artistic, they left Germany and went to France, just like the Spanish left Spain, which was very backward in the 1920s.
Yes.
And they went... That's why Picasso went to France. That's why Dali went to France. So all in all, it became a place of refuge, not just for French artists, but for people coming from Eastern Europe.
Foreign artists.
Foreign artists. And you have Brancusi, who was from Romania, Giacometti, who was actually from Switzerland, but Modigliani, who was from Italy. You have all of these artists and various writers and people even as from far away as Russia who were fleeing the Russian Revolution. they hung out in this part of Paris.
Right.
So it must have been fabulous. And then, of course, you have the Gertrude Stein, who was a great art collector, who helped sustain a whole lot of these artists, even some writers, and kept them alive until they became successful enough so that she didn't have to pay them to actually live.
Right.
So
she was a patron of the arts.
She was a real, true patron of the arts, you know. It
well,
must have been fabulous.
Artists always have needed that. If you want to create something of value, obviously you need the time to do it.
Yeah.
And, so artists were always dependent. But before the 1920s, obviously they were relying on the patronage of rich, noble families.
Right.
And then later it turned into other
and
rich...
then it kind of got democratized in that way, in the 20th century. There's another place called the Brasserie Lippe.
Yes.
That's also, it's just across the street on Saint Germain, Boulevard Saint Germain. And that's another place that apparently in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, it had jazz at night. I don't know if it still does, to be honest. I have no idea.
That's something you could easily check on their
could
website,
check,
see what they say.
Truffaut and Godard and all of the filmmakers used to hang out right in that area too. I mean, it's like one group followed the other. Unfortunately, it is no longer the case.
It's become too expensive.
It's become too touristy.
Yeah. You think it's the touristy that's done it?
Yeah, I really do. Because what happened was there was a period after World War II in the 50s and 60s when it was easy to live in either the Latin Quarter or Saint Germain, and it was very cheap. That's where James Baldwin lived. All these exiled American writers went, the jazzmen and singers went. And then as France became more affluent again, it became chic to live in this area. And apparently the whole thing changed in the 1970s when foreigners, particularly Americans, discovered the area of Saint Germain, and it's how beautiful it is with these beautiful old buildings and houses and narrow streets, and then wealthy artists and intellectuals from other places as well. And they started moving in and basically did what we would call gentrification.
Right.
The buildings never really changed, except obviously on the inside. They got
the rent
fixed
went up and up and up, and only the richest people...
The rents went up, and then starting in the 70s and certainly by the 1980s, it became so fashionable for tourists to visit this area that what happened was a lot of the bookstores went out of business and they turned into chic clothing shops. Mm-hmm. A lot of as I said, the publishing houses went elsewhere because the rent was too expensive there. Mm-hmm. There are still a few art galleries, but most of them moved elsewhere. However, there are things that have always been there for a long time, like on Rue Bonaparte, which is a beautiful street that goes north-south. It starts at the Seine.
Right, starts at the river and goes up to the Luxembourg Gardens.
It goes to the Luxembourg Gardens. I would say down, but it doesn't matter. It's right. South.
It's up because it's actually hilly up a little bit.
South. Doesn't matter.
Oh, shush.
South.
But that's not how it works.
The art school is there, and the École des Beaux-Arts is on Rue Bonaparte and faces also the Seine. But it's a building that's been there since the 1600s. It started under Louis XIV. And because of the prestige of that, plus the prestige of the various bookshops, it developed into an area that became famous for its art galleries and now has many, many art galleries and some bookshops still. But then, of course...
So that's towards the bottom of Rue Bonaparte.
That's as you go towards the Seine.
Yeah, close to the Seine.
Right.
Because it's a long street. It's a
long street.
Maybe 2 miles, I don't know.
I don't even know.
Something like that.
When you go, if you're standing in front of the Church of Saint Germain, where it's this open square. So you have the Café de Magot just opposite you. Mm-hmm. If you go to your right up there on Rue Bonaparte, and you keep going, you have gorgeous little antique shops, art galleries, now many, many fashionable, very expensive little clothing boutiques.
Yeah.
But most of that was inspired by the fact that the Beaux-Arts, the art school, was there and has been there and of course is the most prestigious art school in all of France.
Yeah.
So it's still a functioning art school. So that you have that on one side. You have the Church of Saint Germain des Près, basically on the other side, because that is on the corner of Boulevard Saint Germain, and that kind of gave a general tone to the area. That's why Delacroix was there, because he had studied at the art school there, and people like that. And then I think what happened was that the jazz clubs and the fact that many famous writers starting in the 1960s were in that area brought in other kinds of tourism. Basically, in the 1980s, started becoming what we would call mass tourism. So if you go to the Deux Magots or the Café de Flore, it's packed. They are packed. Personally, I have never even had a coffee in either one, although I wouldn't mind doing it just to say that I did, which is obviously what happens when you're a tourist. But
when I'm there with so many other people. There's never enough room to sit. And if I can't sit, I'm like, well, I don't really want to.
Well, I mean, the truth is that if you go around the corner, there are 2 or 3 other cafes that are wonderful with little tables outside, and they don't cost €5 for an espresso.
Yeah.
So if you, that's why it's
French people are price sensitive. Even French people who live there.
Yes, that's a nice way of putting it, but it's true.
Because they just go, that's highway robbery.
Yes.
And I'm not paying that, even if they are millionaires. So the people who go there are the visitors who feel it's their one chance to go there. And why not? I mean, it's okay.
It's right, exactly. If you're going to do it once in your life, and then you could say, I had my brunch or my breakfast at the Deux Magots or the Café de Flore and there. But the fact is, it's still a neighborhood with lots of little cafes that are delightful.
Of course,
and then if you go back around the church and you get to Rue Bucci and then Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, it's filled with cafes, bakeries, little places to eat.
Places that sell food.
You can go and
Cheese
sit down in a
shops.
little restaurant and have a salad and a coffee, and it won't cost you more than 16 or 17 euros. I mean, these are places that are reasonable in terms of French prices, as opposed to these 2 or 3 places that are just, they go on the hype of what their history is.
Sure.
And so that's how much everything costs there. And then, now, whether this is still technically Saint-Germain-des-Prés, I'm not really sure.
We're not going to argue about that.
We're not going to argue, right? So you and I both agree that we can go as far as the Church of Saint-Sulpice.
Oh, yes. I love that church.
This is the Da Vinci Code church.
That's right. It was used in Da Vinci Code. It's the one that has the Delacroix in it.
Yes.
It's the one that has the gnomon.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure that's how you say it. It's not gnomon.
I don't know.
Sure.
I think it's a Greek word. I'm not really.
It's got to be gnomon.
G and an N or an N and G. No, G and
anyway,
N. I don't know.
It measures something astrological, and right this second, I can't remember what it is that it measures.
Summer solstice.
Summer solstice. Okay. And it's inside of the church, and you can totally miss it because it's got this triangle on the ground, and then opposite the other side of the church, you have a pyramid-looking thing, and it just lines up just right for the summer solstice. It makes a line, and French people, if you look at the 1800s and 1900s, a lot of the major scientists and inventors were French. Because they were at the top of the science game. And so you find some astronomical things in French churches, in several of them. This one is famous, but...
And of course, it's famous because it's this incredible Baroque church. It has concerts every Sunday morning that are free. You can actually go in. There's Mass, but you can sit and listen to the organ concerts. And of course, it's got this huge fountain.
It's not choral concerts?
I was there twice, and it was organ music, but sometimes there is choral music, but I don't think it's regular.
Oh, I'm going to be there on a Sunday morning next time I'm on a tour. And I won't have any customers with me yet, so I'll probably go.
You should check it out.
That would be fun. I would go check it out.
And so that is basically the outer edge of the Saint Germain area. And it cuts across at Rue de Rennes, which is a big shopping street filled with shops. Basically, what happens now is Saint Germain the area has lots of wonderful, beautiful hotels.
Yes.
Lots of restaurants, beautiful boutique clothing shops that are gorgeous with original things and not cheap at all. Really not.
Yeah.
And in between all of that, you can find little places that are relatively modest in price and stuff like that. But it's famous, of course, the whole area is famous for the quality of the historical architecture. Everything there is beautiful.
And it's just the ambiance is nice, and just the fact that it's been so famous for so long. Yeah. You have to see it. And I think it's a really good place to go walk around. If you want to walk around the neighborhood, Rue de Rennes is a good one, or Rue Bonaparte is another good one. They're the major ones. And then in between those two, they kind of go in a V. And then between those two, you have a lot of little streets. Some of them have more or less businesses. It's a really good place if you want to have a picnic in Paris. It's a really good place to go walk around, buy your bread, buy your cheese, buy your saucisson, buy your whatever it is that you want to buy, your apples, whatever. And then head down to the river and sit by the Seine River behind Notre Dame on the banks of the river. You have lots of places where you can sit and enjoy your lunch. It's just a very fun, pleasant walk and pleasant place to visit. And if you are interested in going into the churches, they are absolutely stunning.
They're beautiful. I love Saint Germain des Près. I like it's a fairly dark church on the inside, but the painting on the columns and the walls is very, very beautiful. It still has some very old stained glass, even though some of it has been refurbished. Many of these churches have parts of them that were redone in the 19th century anyway. But I love the fact that it's the tower and the building really show different styles that go from literally the 10th century all the way up. And
isn't that the one that has the one side of the church that they cut off a side of the church to put the fortification wall?
Well, originally, yes. There's a little piece of wall left.
Yes.
And then on the other side, which is, there's a teeny little garden now, a teeny little park garden. It's the Rue de l'Abbaye. Because that is where the cloister and the other monastic buildings were, but that were torn down during the Revolution. So you have a piece of the wall behind the church, and then the rest of it, it's hard to imagine that the Boulevard Saint-Germain, which of course is this enormous wide street cut through by housemen in the 19th century, that is where most of the monastic buildings were. Going in that direction, and behind it, going towards Boulevard Saint-Michel. It was enormous, absolutely enormous. So it's kind of got an atmosphere that I like inside it. And Saint-Sulpice, of course, is a very Baroque church with a huge dome.
Yes.
And columns on the outside and a big fountain in front of it.
And Saint-Sulpice, once a day, you can go up to the organ. They open up, I think it's at 11 in the morning or something. You'd have to check their website, but every day they open and the organist is up there and you can ask questions. And when I went with my in-laws, of course, they're both musicians. And so it was fun they got to talk to the organist and talk to him about some of the pieces he had performed there. And he was so delighted to talk to musicians rather than just tourists who don't know anything about music. So they were asking him about challenging, new music that he's performed. And he was like, oh, yes, these people are knowledgeable.
How did you know that you could do that?
There's a sign.
Oh.
You walk around, and if you read the signs, sometimes you luck out.
I've never seen it. I don't think I would have done it, to be honest. But that's interesting. I didn't know. But it is. I like the atmosphere.
And the De la Croix, lots of people miss it.
They miss it because it's a dark church inside.
Yes, it's a church. It's a dark church, and they just don't even know that there's a De la Croix in there. And it's interesting. It's close to. So if you're entering the church, it's going to be to your right, towards the back of the church.
Yeah.
And you see Saint Michael slaying the dragon. There's two paintings opposite one another, and they are interesting. I've seen other De la Croix that I prefer, but these two are, they're interesting.
They're interesting, and of course it was his neighborhood. Since he at the end of his life, he actually lived in a charming little house. Just
for people like me who like churches, I can spend half of the day in there. Just looking at everything.
Well, I could not, to be very honest.
Most people cannot. Most people will find it really, after half an hour, they're done. And I've seen tour guides bringing people in there, and I kid you not, 5 minutes. I've seen the fat tire tours come in, so they all pile up their things and they all go in there. I think they were in there 2 minutes.
But that's the nature of those kinds of tours.
It is.
I mean, it's kind of like speed dating, It is. It's speed tourism. I mean, it's the kind of thing where you go, okay, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. It's not my thing. It's not your thing. So it's totally different. But I am so entranced by the atmosphere, the architecture, and all of
the atmosphere. You just sit in there and you think about all the things that happened in there. And if you go to their website, you can actually see all of the things that have happened in there, and it's just fascinating to me.
This is one of the things that's wonderful about the Ministry of Culture and the whole history of what's called patrimoine in France, is that they really do invest money into creating these sites now so that you can go and have a virtual visit into different places, and bringing up to date everything as much as possible. The Saint Germain area just really is very, very gorgeous. Even if you were talking about taking a picnic, buying stuff Rue Bucci or one of those streets and taking it towards the back of Notre Dame, you can also go walk back up to the Luxembourg Garden. I mean, there are these little pocket parks.
Yeah, there are tiny parks around there where you could sit and enjoy your lunch.
There's a La Durée for those people who are totally macarooned, and which is right on Rue Bonaparte. And there's a wonderful chocolate place called Richard, which is a place I've taken people to that does wonderful chocolates. There are these exquisite little places everywhere.
Oh, and they're definitely upscale. I mean, I remember right across from Saint-Sulpice, there's an Hermès store, the bags. And I will never forget this in my life, because my daughter, who was very young, maybe 8 or 9, she wanted to go see the big trunk in there because we could see it through the window. But we were not dressed for Hermès at all. I was probably wearing a crazy loud T-shirt, and I was probably sweaty and had my camera backpack and all that. Just not nice. We approach the door. Somebody opens the door and says, "Bonjour, madame. Bonjour, mademoiselle." They were so freaking polite and nice to us. I was like, where have I landed? This is like, I don't look like the kind of person who's ever going to buy anything in here. But still, they were so polite, and they showed the little girl the trunk. Somebody even opened it for her. So nice to us. It was really refreshing. And I never go into high-end stores of any sort, because, unless it's a camera store, obviously. But if it's not a camera store, I don't. And so it's like, but I was impressed. They are pros. They're very good.
They're very good.
And all through that neighborhood is all full of these super fancy stores. I mean, seriously fancy stores.
Seriously fancy, but also for people who are interested in clothing and fashion. Let me tell you, this is part of the Paris where you can find things you won't find just in chain big stores.
Correct.
It's gorgeous.
They
shoes,
do have a
clothes, things.
They do have a few big chain stores. They have some Zara. They have some...
But not right around there.
Right, no.
No, Rue de Rennes maybe, but that's already getting into almost the more popular area. But here you have real boutique shopping, and it's just fabulous for people who can afford it. It really is. Now, if you want less expensive But interesting, you go towards Rue Bucci and Saint-André-des-Arts, which is really the heart of the tourist part, the mass tourist part, but still has some nice little shops. And so it's shopping heaven.
Yeah.
That and the Marais, because I'm not a big department store person. I hate department stores. I get intimidated by them. To me, a department store is kind of like going into a hospital. It's like it's just I don't know where to go.
I like them. I think the one in Saint Germain, le Bon Marché, is really good.
It's not Bon Marché.
Bon Marché means cheap goods. And no, you've never seen such expensive stuff in your life. But that's how it started out, was to be the cheap goods.
And I believe it was begun at the end of the 19th century.
It's been there a long time. It's an interesting historical department store. I think it would be worth a visit myself, but
it's worth a visit. It's just that if I'm going to go shopping, I'm not going to go there.
You would rather go to the vintage stores and
I would rather go to the little boutiques, and then especially if it's sales time.
See, little boutiques frighten me. Because I never know. This is my personal insecurities, I guess. I never know how they're gonna welcome me, and I'm very surprised. Because sometimes in these little boutiques, people are very haughty.
Yes,
and I feel that, and I am not comfortable with that, and it just makes me uncomfortable and mad, and I would rather not go. It's the truth.
I understand that. I mean, I kind of try and
ignore it.
I don't. I try and figure out which ones are like that, and I don't go into those,
Yes.
and then it's just that they're in terms of even window shopping, these boutiques are fabulous, it's that, but that's part of the whole business of walking around. This is a neighborhood for walking. This is not a neighborhood for getting in a car and zooming from one end to the other.
No. You walk and you stop and you look, and you could. I think that's why it's such a nice place to stay in Paris, is because you could make it your center of operations where you return every night and enjoy it every morning and every night a little bit, and then go off and see other things around Paris, and then at night you return and you enjoy Saint Germain. It's that sort of area that, it's not like it's a must. Well, no, it is a must-see destination. I think it is one of the must.
I think it's a must-see for Paris.
Yeah, for Paris. For people who are very interested in Paris, maybe if it's your very first time, you might not make it there, but maybe you should. I think it's lovely, but that's why it's such a good place to get a hotel or an Airbnb, if that's the way you want to go, and so you can be there at the heart of the action and come and go as your visits.
I'm not sure statistically if it's true, but of course it's very close to the Latin Quarter, and both of those areas are the areas that I think are wonderful to stay in anyway, because they have the old little buildings, the narrow streets. But it seems like there's a wonderful concentration of hotels and places to stay in that area too. So it's really
although of late, because of the influence of certain very, very popular guidebooks, they that will remain nameless, they recommend Le Marais more.
Oh, do they?
So on the other side of the river, which is fine, but for me, I would prefer to be in the Latin Quarter or the or the Saint Germain. That's just me.
I mean, the Marais is beautiful, and
it's
the other nice neighborhood with old houses and things like that, but I agree with you. I would much rather be in Saint Germain des Près.
There you go. All right, Elyse, have we gone around the neighborhood long enough?
Well, it's time for us to go have a coffee at Les Deux Magots, Annie.
Who's buying?
I'll treat you this time. You take care of it the next time.
All right, if it's just a coffee, I can probably afford it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Elyse.
You are quite welcome.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Thank you, Tracy Gillespie, Dawn Alstrom, and Carrie Kading for pledging to support the show on Patreon this week. Wow, your names are difficult for my French mouth to say, so I hope I didn't butcher them too much. And thank you to all the other patrons who support the show month after month. Thank you for giving back. To support the show on Patreon, go to patreon.com/join us, patreon.com. Join us, no spaces or dashes, and you guys rock. Thank you so much. Now for my personal update. Well, this time it's a really fun one. You see, my daughter has a friend who volunteers at the local dog shelter. And I told her, well, if you hear about a standard poodle at the shelter, please let me know. Well, she immediately went home and checked out the website for the Toulouse animal shelter, which I hadn't done. And she saw this poodle that was listed as grand, grand caniche, which means big poodle. Well, from the photo, I couldn't tell anything. It was just a mass of black, jumbled, unkempt hair. So it was impossible to tell. So she told me about this on May 1st, which is a holiday in France. Everything was closed, including the dog shelter. So I had to wait for the next day. And the next day I go when they opened and was greeted by a very nice lady who happens to live right close to my house. And we didn't know each other. And she told me that, of course, she knew about the little black poodle. She says, yes, he's big. Okay, so she takes me to this little guy, and he is a miniature poodle, which to French people looks big. He's just 24 pounds. He's very small. And they tell me that he's been at the shelter for a month, which broke my heart because, no dog deserves to be at a dog shelter, but a poodle at a dog shelter? Have you been to a dog shelter? It's noisy and smelly and just hell on earth. And it's probably awful for all dogs, but some of these bigger, tougher dogs, you don't feel so bad for them. Anyway, I don't. Maybe I'm wrong, but anyway, so I met him. I asked about his medical history, and they told me he had a little heart murmur, nothing. And I asked them to give me the details. And from the dog shelter, I called my own vet, who had followed my dogs and our cat for a long time. And I told her, this is the situation. What do you think? And she told me, well, it sounds like a pretty typical poodle problem. And it could be nothing, but it could be a big problem. So I can't really tell you until we've done some tests. But she said, if you don't want heartache, this is not a good dog for you. She did say that. Well, so the next day I made an appointment to take this dog to my vet, my own vet, instead of the shelter vet, because a veterinarian at the shelter, they have hundreds of dogs under their care, and they go too fast. So I thought, well, maybe we'll see. So this nice shelter volunteer, because this is not my dog, I can't check out the dog to take it to my vet. So this nice volunteer at the shelter brings the dog to my vet, and he gets examined, and he has a pretty bad heart murmur, and we will probably need to put him on medications right away. He's going to need a heart ultrasound to figure out exactly what's wrong with his heart and treat accordingly. But we think he's 7 years old. He is sweet, sweet, sweet as can be. So as soon as I heard from the vet that, there was things we could do to keep him going for a while, I said, okay, I'm going to take him. But I had to let him go back to the shelter because he was still not my dog. So the next day, so that's Saturday, I got to go to the shelter, sign the paperwork, and he is now my dog. And he is very, very sweet. Now, as you know, if you've been listening to the show for a while, I've been a volunteer for the guide dog school in Toulouse as well. And so at the guide dog school, I have rubbed shoulders with a lot of dog trainers. And so I know a lot of, and I've had lots of dogs at my house. They come and go. Sometimes I take a dog over a few days because his regular family is away on vacation or something. And I've had dozens of dogs in my house as a result, of all ages, puppies, 2-year-old, whatever, sometimes older even. If a blind person goes on vacation and they need a place for the dog to be while they are away. So I'm kind of used to dogs and I have a fair amount of experience. So I was watching this dog like a hawk. I was like, okay, you dog are not going to chew up anything in here and you're not going to pee on anything. And, I was keeping a really, really close watch on him. And it turned out I didn't have to. The whole day, the first day, I didn't have to correct him once. He didn't do anything bad. He kept following me around, really, really excited to be in the house. He was so happy. And he is just a sweet, sweet little dog. So we named him Gus. Gustave. Because I wanted something short, because we have no idea what his original name was. So we wanted something short that he could learn within a few hours. And surely enough, you say his name a few times, you reward when he turns his head. And yeah, he knows his name now. And I thought, okay, I got to let him off leash a little bit and see if he comes back. Sure, viens, come, was very easy within, we tried it 10 times and he was good. Sit, he's still not 100%, but assis, he will do pretty well most of the time. And just like a guide dog, I make him sit before we cross the street. He's never had to do that before, even if he knew how to sit. But I like dogs to just stop before they cross the street. So even if they don't know if there's a car coming or something, but the drivers will have a chance to see the dog if he's ever loose and whatever. Anyway, I think I have a disease that I love poodles so much. I think it's not normal, but it's really a breed of dog that fits my personality very, very well. I'm not precious or I don't brush them, and I don't color their hair. I don't do anything like that. I just like the kind of the personality of the poodle. So after the passing of my own standard poodle in January, I have been dogless, besides the guide dogs that come and go and are not mine. And I must admit, having this little dog in our house, who is very much a poodle, he behaves just like the standard poodle. It's kind of freakish. It's been lovely, I have to say. So I'm a very lucky woman that I got to rescue a dog who is 7 years old, and not in great health, but hopefully we can give him many, many good years to come. So if you have a miniature poodle and you belong to the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook, please post photos, and I will post a photo soon. I need to take good photos not with the iPhone, because I have an older iPhone. I don't get great photos with it. So I'll break out the actual camera and get some good photos of the poodle to share with you on the Facebook group. At Join Us in France, we put France in your ears, and poodles too. And you've obviously found a way that works for you to listen to the show. I would love for you to help other people find the show too, so they can learn what they need to know to have a great time in France. If you have friends or acquaintances or co-workers who are going to be visiting France this summer, tell them that they can listen to the show with their Alexa smart speaker or with their smartphone using Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, or with any number of podcast apps. The show is really easy to find, but you do have to know that it's there and that it's called Join Us in France. And they can even listen on the website if they're not comfortable with apps and things like that. JoinUsInFrance.com, and you can listen to all the episodes right there. To connect with me, email Annie at joinusinfrance.com or leave a message at 1-801-806-1015. And you can also join the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook. When you do, please answer the questions. I have been gathering all the questions that you answer recently because I love them. I love reading how you found the show and why you want to join. It's really good. But I can't talk back at that point. All I can do is just... I see your name, I see why you like the show, and I can accept or decline or block, and that's all I can do. I can't talk back. But I enjoy reading all of these requests to join the show. Have a great week of trip planning, and I'll talk to you next week. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2018 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.